A perfectionist is someone who tends to have unrealistically high expectations of themselves, sometimes even of others in their lives. Often they're quick to be critical of little mistakes that they might make. It can be anything. It can be as simple as forgetting a book for class or putting away something in the refrigerator. Um, these are all things that they'd probably be really critical of themselves. It becomes almost an ultimate situation then. Oftentimes, they also tend to be bad with compliments. So, if you were to go about complimenting them, they'd probably be really shocked and say, "Oh, that's not me. That's really not me."
I believe a perfectionist is somebody who is often striving for flawlessness in their work. They do set a lot of idealistic expectation about how that task is to be attained. There's very little room for mistakes, and a lot of control is exercised in how one reaches that goal. One hallmark of a perfectionist would be that often their self worth is tied to the outcome of that task. I think increasingly we are beginning to realize that a lot of clinical conditions are associated with perfectionism, aside from the fact that it does lead to procrastination, things not never getting done on time, overcompensation. It could also lead to depressive and anxious features. It could lead to eating disorders. There could be chronic stress. There could be chronic fatigue, insomnia. The list goes on. It does have an effect on our everyday lives, and not just that, our behaviors, our emotions, but also over our interpersonal relationships.
Perfectionism comes with some unique challenges. I think the most commonly presenting challenge I encounter is the avoidance of difficult tasks because of a fear of failure. This usually presents itself as procrastination, so putting away something that I'm supposed to do. Um, so it's almost as if as long as I postpone a difficult task and complete it in the last minute, I can tell myself that had I had more time, I would have done better, right? I think another challenge with perfectionism is, I would say, the lack of creativity, since perfectionists prefer working through a sort of algorithm to ensure that they win. There is very little room left then for creativity. One large impact I see social media having over perfectionism is the rising tendency to compare outcomes rather than processes. It becomes easier to focus on the other person's picture perfect outcome through their pictures or even through their 140 characters. Oftentimes, we're not privy to what goes on into the production of a perfect picture or tweet. So, there's always this misalignment. So often the perfectionist is almost has this narrative that, oh, look at that person, they have it really easy, and here I am just getting started on my project. I don't know how that's going to go for me. Why isn't it easier, right?
I guess we are very used to seeing picture perfect things on social media. I think one needs to realize that it's a collage of curated snapshots, right? Like, it presents the world in a certain way, and it's not probably the entirety of one's life. I guess when we see that a lot, when we consume that a lot, we begin to believe that these are very easily attainable. So it disappoints us when it doesn't turn out to be such a linear process. I think on the other hand, there is something to be said about social media. I think there's a lot of good information out there. So what is important is this, that one begins to look at the information and the sources from which we are consuming that information. It's important that we look at them a little bit more critically, like, which is to say that they need to be evaluated a little bit more carefully. I think it's important that we don't always look at perfectionism as an asset. One can strive for flawlessness without really tying it to our self worth. I agree that in a lot of contexts, and certain context does demand that we do our job as accurately and flawlessly as possible. So a distinction is that it should be looked as a demand of the job and not as our life and not from our own self all the time itself. There should be there should also be room for personal enjoyment and, fulfillment while we are doing these tasks.
Well, the upside is that perfectionism has been associated with a high achievement orientation. And so, since perfectionists are driven by progress and success, they tend to be able to motivate themselves for the most part. So, even in the face of an adversity, they can come through for themselves because they're often working relentlessly towards their success. But since the difficulty perfectionists encounter is too much task orientation, successful perfectionists often come across as, let's say, high achievers, and the difficulty that they experience towards all of that, towards doing that, is mostly invisible. I think step zero is the acknowledgement of perfectionism. Once that is done, working towards self compassion and not evaluating your worth based on the successes that you have is probably the journey to take. Because moving away from that schema that I am a product of my productivity and moving towards I am valid no matter what uh, I do is an important shift to make, because developing a better relationship with our worth allows us to set moderate achievable goals and not go overboard, really. That way, I think we can really get the best of whatever we need to achieve without also beating ourselves down. So creating that sort of balance, creating that sort of stability is the goal, right?
I think it goes a long way if one catches themselves, you know, when one is self-blaming, or when one resorts to self-critical thoughts, especially when we are trying to, like, attain something, or we are working towards a certain goal. um, I think to be able to demarcate, or to be able to disengage the idea of self-worth from the achievements, can make the process much more enjoyable.